The Taoiseach all but ruled out holding a referendum on blasphemy yesterday in the Dáil, saying that these things are not as simple as they might sound, that when you get into the arguments for and against, the referendum debate could become very complicated. And he was also making the point that the last time there was a prosecution in this country for blasphemy was in 1855, which is not yesterday or the day before. Obviously, John Hamill is a member of the executive committee of Atheist Ireland, and he's on the line with us this morning. Good morning to you, John, and thanks for joining us here on the programme this morning. This obviously follows a lot of head scratching over the course of the last week, when the Irish Times reported that Gardaí were investigating a complaint about comments made by Stephen Fry to Gay Byrne in The Meaning of Life on RTE television, and as to whether they were blasphemous and whether he should have been prosecuted or not. You had hoped that he would be prosecuted so that it would bring about an end to this type of complaint.
Yes, that's right, and I think that's the best way to highlight how absurd and risible the law is. If we had a prosecution, if we have laws in the statute book that can't be prosecuted, then that's just a recipe for more and more complaints that will waste more and more Garda time investigating complaints against laws that can't lead to any prosecutions. It's just a ridiculous situation, really. But the Garda statement actually is even more concerning than the lack of a prosecution. In fact, it highlights a specific issue with the law that we raised when the legislation was brought to the Dáil in 2009 by Dermot Ahern, and that is the law provides an incentive for large groups of people to become outraged over religious issues. So if you look at the decision point that the Gardaí and the DPP have in terms of determining whether the law has been broken, it doesn't provide a list of deities in the law that you're not allowed to be mean about. It doesn't provide a list of mean things that you're not allowed to say about any god. The test as to if and how the law has been broken is if there's a substantial number of people who have become outraged. And what the Gardaí have said is that the reason why they're not pursuing the prosecution is not because what Stephen Fry said isn't blasphemous. It's because they can't find enough people who are outraged. Now, your listeners may remember some issues that happened not too long ago. For example, the Danish cartoons. And in response to the Danish cartoons, there were widespread riots all over the world. There were a number of Danish embassies that were destroyed. So what we're saying here in Ireland is that if you wish to procure a prosecution for blasphemy, that's how you have to behave. You have to get large numbers of people outraged, and unless you have large number of people outraged, you cannot procure a prosecution for this law that exists on the statute book.
And what does that mean? I mean, if I ring around to 10 friends or 20 or 100, I mean, what is a large group?
Well, that's exactly the problem. All of these things are undefined in the law, and what's also undefined is which deities that you can or can't be mean about. So, for example, our Christian listeners will be aware that when Jesus was sentenced to death, he was sentenced to death because he was brought before the Jewish Sanhedrin and accused of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God. Now, if Jesus returned to your studio now, Michael, and told you in your studio that he's the Son of God, according to Dermot Ahern, he can be prosecuted for blaspheming against the Jewish faith. So the only difference between the law that had Jesus executed and the law that Dermot Ahern passed is the severity of the punishment that applies upon prosecution.
But isn't that the point, that it's next to impossible to define what a large group of people? It's ambiguous.
Well, it is ambiguous, which is a good reason to repeal the law. But I think the Taoiseach misses the point when he describes the issue as the number of prosecutions that have taken place, because the law has an effect outside of the number of prosecutions, and there are two main issues there. One is the chilling effect here in Ireland, and the second is the international effect. So people might be familiar with the comedy sketch show The Savage Eye, and that famously had some sketches censored by RTE because they were blasphemous. Personally, I've been asked to write a newspaper article about Marian operations here in Ireland, and in the article I referred to Mary as a carpenter's wife, and the editor of the newspaper pulled the article because he considered referring to Mary as a carpenter's wife to be blasphemous. I remember I had a discussion with him when I explained that actually it was the Bible that described Mary as a carpenter's wife, and if he disputed that fact, it was him that was blaspheming and not me. But nevertheless, the article was still pulled in case it offended Irish Christians. So the question you have to ask is...
Or the editor, perhaps. He could come to that decision anyway, couldn't he?
Well, the issue is that the Irish media self-censor themselves. There is a chilling effect in the Irish media because local newspapers, local radio stations like yourselves...
Yeah, but that's foolish. It is. I mean, you've already made the point that the law is so ambiguous that nobody could ever be prosecuted. That's precisely what Dermot Ahern, who was Minister for Justice at the time, said was the intention when he introduced the Act in 2009, and since then, nobody has been prosecuted for exactly that reason.
Well, you say it's foolish, Michael, but I've sat in rooms with editors, and I've told them it's foolish, and their attitude is that they don't want to risk a prosecution where they'll be asked to pay legal fees and be asked to pay 25,000 euros that they don't have. Right. So it's easy for you to say that it's foolish, but the editors are making decisions to pull material.
Okay.
There is a censoring effect from this law, and actually the more important effect is the international one. So Pakistan, acting on behalf of the Organisation of Islamic Countries, brought exactly verbatim the language of the Irish blasphemy law to the United Nations, and they wanted the United Nations Human Rights Council to propose this language as a recommendation for blasphemy laws that should be promoted internationally.
Okay.
Now, just 1 second. In Pakistan, the penalty for blasphemy is death. There is a lady called Asia Bibi, who is a Christian lady. She has been accused of blasphemy against the Muslim religion. She has been on death row in Pakistan for 7 years, waiting to be executed for blasphemy. Now, if you or I wish to campaign on behalf of Asia Bibi, if you or I wish to campaign for the idea that Christians who commit blasphemy should not be executed, it's very difficult for us to do that if at the same time we're introducing our own blasphemy laws.
Okay, John, but we are in agreement, you and I, on that idea of it being foolish not to publish. I mean, as you say, that's the point you were making to the editors. Yes. It's exactly the point I was putting to you, the one that you were making yourself. And I was basing it on what Dermot Ahern, the minister at the time, was saying when he introduced the Act, was that nobody would ever be prosecuted because the law is so ambiguous. And the minister was saying that the only way of changing it is by removing it from the Constitution. That requires a referendum. And during a referendum, he says you bring out headbangers on all sides.
Well, firstly, Dermot Ahern is being extremely disingenuous when he says that the purpose of his legislation was to make the law unprosecutable, because the reason the law had to be brought in was because the previous case, the court threw out the previous case on the basis that it couldn't be prosecuted because blasphemy wasn't sufficiently well defined. So Dermot Ahern brought in the law to define blasphemy to make it easier to prosecute the case. The reason why Dermot Ahern changed the law in 2009 was to make it more likely and more possible to prosecute for blasphemy. And so since 2009, we've had RTA pulling comedy sketches on the Savage Eye, and we've had Pakistan bring Dermot Ahern's language to the United Nations and tell the United Nations that everyone should introduce blasphemy laws like Dermot Ahern's law. So I would suggest to Dermot Ahern that when he's on the same side of the argument of blasphemy as Pakistan, that he's taken a wrong turn somewhere.
All right, listen, we'll leave it there for the moment. But thank you indeed for joining us here this morning, John. It's much appreciated. Thank you. John Hamill, member of the Executive Committee of Atheist Ireland.